Dad stroked his son's head and thought that he should protect him at all costs. In his voice, he said that Xiaoze is a handsome boy and always makes his dad happy. The respectable man was already waiting for his grandson and his son in his room. Rumors spread very quickly, so he was almost the first to learn that his grandson had a 4-year-old son and wanted to look at him. When Gong Yixiao entered the room, he immediately informed the grandfather that he had complied with his request and brought his son to him to look at him. The man's heart began to beat faster. The man knew that the grandfather had a very strict character, so he was careful not to talk too much to Xiaoze and did not traumatize his childhood psyche. But the little boy shouted that he was glad to see his great-grandfather and ran to him. The strict grandfather looked at the boy with a watchful eye. He touched his head and said that he looked a lot like Ye Xiao when he was a child. Therefore, he really admits that this guy is from the Gong family. Then the grandfather turned his stern gaze to the grandson and asked him why their child had not been brought up these 4 years in the Gong family, as it should be for their family members. Gong Yixiao decided that it would be better to chat with the grandfather in private, so he asked the butler to go outside and play with the boy. Xiaoze promised to obey the butler's uncle and went with him. When the boy and the butler left the room, Gong Yixiao decided to confess to his grandfather that he had gotten very drunk that evening, which is how little Xiao was born Zi. The grandfather carefully listened to his grandson's explanation. The grandfather said that the mother of this boy was previously married, and did she divorce now that she and her grandson live together? Gong Yixiao told how the circumstances of their relationship really are. Then the grandfather asked if the woman would mind if the boy went to their Gong family to be raised. But the grandson said that he wants to live next to him for a year to replace the boy's need for his mother. The grandfather carefully listened to his grandson's plan and praised him for his cleverness. Then he added that the grandson should remember that he should not get close to the woman because her ex-husband is Lu. At that moment, Gong Yixiao thought that nearly a quarter of a century had already passed, and Grandpa's enmity with the Lu family had not diminished. He knew how his grandfather felt about the representatives of this particular family. When Grandpa left the room, Gong Yixiao was still standing there, silently thinking about the conversation with Grandpa. It was only 100% clear that this woman was actually asking for trouble. A young girl was holding an invitation letter to an art exhibition. It was so difficult to get to her, but she had to go to dinner with the Gong family, and she did not know what to choose. Chen Li Yue decided that Gong Yixiao would take care of the little one anyway, so it wouldn't be too bad if she took a break from the Gong family. Therefore, the young girl picked up the phone and dialed Gong Yixiao's number. When the phone was taken off, Chen Li asked to keep an eye on Xiao for a while, because she wants to visit the exhibition, and it will end late. Before she had time to prove another good reason why she needed to go there, Gong Yixiao said he was fine and hung up. Chen Li was simply stunned by such rudeness. At that time, Gong Yixiao called the manager and told him to prepare his car immediately. When the manager asked where the president was going, he replied that he was going to an exhibition. The manager immediately picked up the phone and dialed Xiaoling, Xiaowu, and Secretary Vaughn. He said that they checked 18 sports clubs and 5 conference centers immediately. The manager said that they found out exactly where the exhibition will be held, because the boss is going there. Meanwhile, Gong Yixiao thought that a woman who dreams of leaving him should continue to dream. There were a lot of visitors at the exhibition, and it was very difficult to get an invitation, even though there was no free space in the hall. Everyone wanted to see these works of art with their own eyes. Inside, there was an atmosphere of complete admiration. Visitors quietly whispered, expressing their admiration for such incredibly well-made works. Chen Li wore a very revealing dress that her sister Linda had given her that evening. The dress successfully emphasized the figure of the young girl, and she was somewhat embarrassed by the extra attention in her direction. As she walked past the paintings, Che Li Yue couldn't help but be happy that she finally got to see them with her own eyes, as she had been waiting for this exhibition for a very long time. But the viewing of pictures was constantly interrupted by some men who wanted to get to know the beautiful beauty. One of them dared to approach and offered to drink a glass of wine with him. Chen Li did not like such extra attention. She just wanted to enjoy the art in peace and go home. So she told her husband that she didn't drink alcohol, expecting him to fall behind. But the man was not going to lag behind. When the girl turned away and was about to leave, the man came up from behind and hugged her by the waist. He asked how about dancing with him. Very soon that man was joined by several others who were also counting on the attention of such a beauty, and began to offer the girl to talk about high art with them alone. They were so eager to offer her some suggestions that Chen-Li's only thought at that time was that someone had already saved her and pulled her out of this terrible male circle. It was at that moment that Chen-Li felt someone wrap an arm around her waist. She thought it was another suitor. As soon as she turned her head, she saw Gong Yexiao standing next to her. The president looked sternly at the suitors and told them to get away from here. Chen-Li decided at that moment not to interfere in men's showdowns and listen to the solution. The men all ran away from the young couple as one. After all, everyone understood who was in front of them, and no one was even going to enter into a conflict with President Gosen. Chen-Li asked the president why he was here, but he only told the young girl that she dressed in such a way as to attract excessive attention of the male sex or even to seduce them. The young girl did not like such comments from the president, so she asked him what he had against it. After all, they are nobody to each other, and he has no right to comment. But before Chen-Li could prove her claims, she felt her hand being firmly grasped. She looked over and saw Gong Yexiao grab her hand and start pulling her somewhere. Passing through the exhibition hall, all visitors paid attention to how the president was dragging a woman behind him. Rumors began to spread where people invented who this girl was and what the relationship between them was. When he reached the car, the president threw Chen-Li in there and said that he warned that the mother of his son must have an impeccable reputation and should think 100 times before dressing so openly. The young girl was rubbing her hand, which was excruciatingly painful after the president dragged her along. Chen-Li Yue shouted to Gong Yexiao what he wanted from her, and the president quickly got into the car and lay down on top of the young girl. When his lips were on hers, he said that if she needed a man to satisfy her, he wouldn't mind doing it. Chen-Li Yue wanted to say that she didn't need anyone and that he was making up some fool for himself, but before she could open her mouth, his lips were already mastering her lips. Gong Corporation drove to the president's residence at great speed. Of course, the young girl was shocked that Gong Yexiao would allow himself such behavior. On the way, she stopped by Gong Yexiao's grandfather to take the baby home. Bo Xiao by this time, Zi was at his great-grandfather's estate and playing with the nannies. Chen-Li was already starting to miss her son. The president suggested that Chen-Li leave his son at the estate to be with his great-grandfather because it was too late. That young girl shouted that it would not be for nothing. Chen-Li couldn't let her son get too close to the Gong family because then they might take him away from her. Gong Yexiao assured that the son would only spend one night with his great-grandfather, and that was it. And then, the president added that whether she wants it or not, Xiaozi will have to return to the Gong family sooner or later anyway. That young girl shouted that who even came up with such a thing. Gong Yexiao also began to speak in raised tones and told Chen-Li that the little one belonged to the Gong family, so it was his duty to return here. Chen-Li no longer had the strength to argue with the president. She burst into tears and shouted where was his family when she gave birth to a son on her own and worried about him for 4 years. Chen-Li was in despair and asked Gong Yexiao where his family was when she raised her son on her own and what right they now have to take the child away from her after so many years. Gong Yexiao walked up to the young girl and took her face in his hands. He asked why she was crying. After all, she cries more than their little son during the time they were together. The young girl threw away his hands and shouted that it was none of his business how much she should cry. He generally appeared recently in their lives and has no right to poke his nose into it. Gong Yexiao looked at the young girl who didn't know what to do and was helpless and decided not to complicate the situation further or ask her anything. The president said he would go inside and pick up their son while she was to wait by the car. He remembered how his grandfather strictly ordered not to bring anyone into the house except his grandson. Gong Yexiao went to his grandfather's house, where his son was already waiting for him. Xiaozi was very happy to see his dad, so he quickly ran into his arms and they left the house together. As soon as the eyes of the little one saw his mother, he immediately shouted her name and asked his father to carry him faster, because he already had time to miss his mother. Chen-Li was also waiting for the little one to get to her. Finally, Chen-Li waited for her son and hugged him tightly. When they approached Gong Yexiao's estate, the man offered to help carry his son, but Chen-Li refused and decided to carry the baby herself. The young woman proudly carried the baby past the president. She already had time to miss the little one, but even more now she was afraid that he might be taken away from her. Chen Li didn't want to let go of her son even as she climbed to the second floor of the mansion. Meanwhile, the president thought that the young woman must be protecting herself from him in this way. But while climbing the stairs, Chen Li touched a precious vase and began to worry that it might break. The young woman turned to pick up the vase and lost her coordination. After only a few minutes, Chen Li felt herself lose her balance and fall to the bottom. She also couldn't lean on her hands because she was holding Xiao tightly. Ze even rejected the idea that he should be let go. The young woman had already mentally imagined how she would fall to the floor and suddenly felt someone's strong hands pick her up. She raised her head and saw that Gong Yixiao was holding both her and her son in his arms. Little Xiao was most happy to be saved. He joyfully and loudly shouted that his dad is the strongest, his dad is the most agile, and they have nothing to fear in this life with such a dad. The young woman was quite embarrassed to be in such an awkward position, so she asked the president to put her on the floor immediately. But Gong Yixiao didn't even think to comply with Chen Li's request. He said that she injured her leg. When the vase is broken, you need to inspect it. He also told Chen Li not to move and carried her to the bedroom. In the bedroom, the little son immediately got into bed and quickly fell asleep. He was so exhausted from the busy day's events that he didn't resist when his parents put him to bed. Meanwhile, Gong Yixiao examined the young woman's injured leg and bandaged it. He said, "How can you be so inattentive when you are carrying a child in your arms?" Chen Li herself did not understand how this happened. Sitting on the bed and watching the president deftly rewind her leg, the young woman hoped that this man would not take her son anywhere. She just wanted to believe it. The following Monday, Chen Li and the president took their son by the hand to his new school. Even the little one's mouth dropped open in surprise at how cool schools can be. The young woman also had a look of surprise on her face, because this educational institution was significantly different from the preparatory school they had attended until today. Ta Xiaozi suddenly stopped and said that he did not want to go to this school. The parents were very surprised and decided to find out what the matter was. So Chen Li gently patted his head and asked why. But the little boy unexpectedly told his parents that he didn't want to go there because he wanted to stay with both mom and dad. Chen Li smiled and told him to be obedient, and she would get him out of there soon. But the little one insisted on his own. He heard his parents' conversations, so he guessed that there was currently a rather severe struggle for his stay with one of them. Therefore, he asked if they would both take him. Gong Yixiao decided to intervene in the situation, so he sat down next to Chen Li, hugged her, and said that of course they would both pick him up from school, and in the future they would always be the three of them. Xiaozi was very happy when he heard this, because he wanted so much that he was finally in a complete family, where there is a mother and a father. So he hugged both of them tightly and thanked them for it. Little Xiao's little finger, Zi and the little finger of his father, who had just promised that they would always be three, touched, and they promised each other that they could not back down from their words. Only Xiaozi heard how Dad said the cherished words. He cheerfully jumped to school, where his new teacher was already waiting for him. Chen Li looked at the president and told him not to lie again. Unsatisfied, Chen Li stood with her lips pouting. At that time, the president firmly grabbed her by the waist and pulled her to him. He asked who said he cheated on the kid, and they just needed to get married. Then the young woman pushed the president away and said that who would want to marry him anyway. He was very surprised at Chen Li's reaction, because all the girls just dreamed of marrying him. Then the president decided to make a deal with the young woman. He approached her and said that if they did not get married in a year, he would withdraw custody of his son. Such an agreement even surprised the young woman. She looked at him with hopeful eyes and asked if he was joking with such a deal. But the president did not think to back down from his words. Gong Yixiao offered to write down all his words if she didn't trust him. Chen Li thought and said that she will do so because she has not trusted his words for a long time. Tom's young woman took out her phone from her purse and asked him to repeat it again. When the recorder was turned on, Gong Yixiao, looking into the young woman's eyes, repeated that he vowed that if they didn't get married in a year, he would give up custody of his son. They looked into each other's eyes. At that moment, Chen Li thought that with such a record, the president would not be able to take her son away from her. And the president, at that time, thought that she did not yet know what a master of seduction he was. All day in her office, Chen Li Yue pondered today's events near the school. It never left her head, so there was no time to talk about work. She was just looking at the laptop monitor. For a few minutes, The young woman thought that the president was quite handsome and began to worry that he might actually marry her and slammed the table in anger. At that moment, the phone rang and Chen Li thought that she would finally be distracted from her thoughts. But when she picked up the phone, she heard the president's voice. He offered to take his son along. The young woman agreed and said that she would come down from the office now. But when Chen Li was already outside, she began to look for Gong Yexiao with her eyes, but she could not find him anywhere. But unexpectedly, the wife of her ex-husband appeared in front of the young woman. She was just angry and yelled at Chen Li that she finally waited for that bitch to go outside. Chen Li listened to the woman's wails and calmly said that Miss Shen could not offend people even if she was a client of their company, and continued to look for the president. The angry woman then shouted that Yang Xuan had become cold towards her and accused Chen Li of continuing to look for him. She also warned not to approach him under any circumstances. But Chen didn't care about this lady's chatter. She wanted to wait for Gong Yexiao and go pick up her little one. Therefore, she replied that she was not interested in jerks. Shen Junyao decided to kill the calm Chen Li and said that she had long wanted to find out who the father of her illegitimate child really is. She knew that this was a painful topic and wanted to make it more painful. Here, the always calm Chen Li Yue couldn't hold back. She got angry and slapped Shen Jun so deliciously Yao, she could barely stay on her feet. The haughty Miss Shen did not expect this. Then Shen Junyao shouted, "How dare this bastard even raise a hand on her?" She also added that she was definitely not going to tolerate this and pounced on Chen Li with her fists. Jun did not make it. Yao reached the frightened Chen Li when someone firmly grabbed her hand and held her back. When the woman looked up, she saw a disgruntled president Gong Yexiao holding her. Shen Junyao could not believe her own eyes. After all, a man of such a high rank is now standing in front of her and holding her hand. She was in such shock that she could not utter a word. The president then said sternly to Shen Junyao that if he ever sees her offending Chen Li Yue, he will not just watch it, and the attacker will get the full program. Gong Yexiao approached the surprised Chen Li and asked if she was okay after such an incident. The young Inca shook her head and said that they were already late, so they had to go. Chen Li, hand in hand with the president, Gong Yexiao walked towards his car, and Shen Jun was indignant. Yao glared at them. She couldn't find a place to be angry at that moment. Shen Junyao angrily shouted that if Chen Li wants to pick on the president, then don't even dream about it, because she will tell everyone about her illegitimate child very soon. On the way to school, Gong Yexiao asked Chen Li who the crazy woman was and why she hit her. He was unhappy that someone could raise a hand against the mother of his son. Li didn't want to talk much about the relationship with that woman, especially about her order and the conversation in the office. So Chen Li simply replied that she was Lu Yangshuan's wife, and she was just as boring as him. The president continued to drive the car in silence, and thought that Chen Li had answered in such a way about the relationship with that woman that he had the impression that she was still communicating with Lu Yangshuan. When the young people approached the school, Chen Li asked if the president was going to move to a new house next to the school, as he had said a few days earlier. The young woman then suggested that they go to the supermarket and buy some groceries for dinner after they pick up their son from school. Gong Yexiao willingly agreed to such a proposal. The little boy was already waiting for his parents at the school entrance and ran to meet them. When Mom and Dad took Xiao away, so, as agreed, we went to the shopping center to buy some products. As the three of them strolled through the shopping streets, Gong Yexiao warned Chen Li that when they moved into a new apartment, they will have to manage themselves, because they will not have a maid. The young girl listened to the president and replied that it was good, although she mentally noted that she will only be a guest in that apartment and not a full-fledged owner. The supermarket was full of people. Everyone was in a hurry to buy some food for dinner after a hard day's work and finally go home. That is why there were long queues at the cash registers. Ye Xiao waited with a basket of groceries and his son, while Li took the line at the cash register. But the little boy couldn't wait for his mother anymore and shouted loudly for everyone to move faster because his mother and father couldn't wait any longer. Chen Li's turn. The saleswoman smiled and asked if it was her husband's card, because she heard the boy a few minutes ago asking everyone to move faster. Chen Li was not comfortable that someone would think that President Gong Yexiao was her husband, so she began to make excuses to the cashier that the man was not her husband at all. But the priest looked at the young woman with some suspicion and said that even if there is a child from a man, then why hide it? Chen Li herself did not know how to explain this relationship to strangers, so she decided not to continue the conversation with such awkward questions and said that it was difficult to explain. When the young girl paid for the groceries, she decided to give the card to Gong Ye Xiao. She walked up to him and held out the card, saying that he could take his card. But Gong Ye Xiao also witnessed Chen Li's conversation with the cashier, so he decided to poke the young woman and told her that since it was her husband's card, she could keep it for herself. On Chen Li's face, because these tricks on his part regarding the marriage had already started to annoy her, so she angrily replied that she did not want to take that card. Chen Li was holding that card, and since the president didn't want to take it voluntarily, the young girl decided to just put it in his pocket, but missed and started shoving the card between his legs. But when Chen Li realized that she mistakenly touched his intimate place, her cheeks turned red from shame, and she began to apologize for not wanting to touch it. But the president was not lost. He came even closer to the young woman and took her by the head. Then he pulled her to him and started whispering in her ear, something that made Chen Li almost fall through the ground. Gong Ye Xiao whispered in the young woman's ear that she was so brave to allow herself such intimate games with him in the middle of a mall in front of hundreds of people. The little guy also witnessed such a scene, and he did not understand what was happening between his parents. That's why Xiaozhe simply asked them what they were doing, because he did not understand what was happening. At that moment, Chen Li came to her senses and realized that they should not forget that their son sees everything. They pushed the president away and said he was a complete fool because Xiaozi is nearby. Therefore, the young woman defiantly turned away from Gong Ye Xiao and took the basket of groceries in her hands. She told her son loudly that they would go home now. The president stood for a few more minutes and looked at the young beauty from behind. At that moment, he thought that she did not know yet, but sooner or later she would voluntarily jump into bed with him. Chen Li's next morning at work did not start with a cup of coffee. An assistant came to her office and informed her that the company had sued her for her design for plagiarism. Chen Li said that it was simply impossible because she was the first to release that design. That assistant said the company wanted Chen Li to resign to settle the dispute. The assistant told Chen Li that she had tried to explain this to their company's head office, but the applicant had too much power and it would be impossible to win this dispute in court. While the girls were talking, another employee of the company knocked on the office and said that the police had come to the office to look for Chen Li. All the girls were shocked by the recent events. Linda and Chen Li even had time to discuss all the nuances. The police representatives were already walking quickly through the corridors of the office towards the young girl. The police have served Chen Li with a warrant to seal her office for some investigation because she is accused of commercial plagiarism. Linda stood in front of the police and asked them to wait while she said something to Chen Li. The police representatives agreed to wait a few minutes and warned her to do it faster. As Linda leaned over the young girl, Chen Li said that she was innocent and that she should believe her. Chen Li was scared and confused. She didn't know what to do next. Linda then replied that this time it was not about Chen Li's innocence at all. After all, the opposite side is too strong, and now the only way out will be to turn to Gong Ye Xiao for help. Chen Li didn't want to beg the president for help, but Linda said that now was not the time to be arrogant, because once the accusation of plagiarism was confirmed, her career would be over. Chen Li was forced to admit the true reality of Linda's words, and therefore decided to look for the president in his office. Gong Ye Xiao was sitting at his desk when Chen Li explained what was going on. The young woman said she was accused of plagiarism and her office was sealed off for an investigation. Although in reality, she did nothing of the sort and all the accusations are made up. The president listened carefully to the young woman's problem and asked if she wanted him to help her solve this problem. Yi Chen Li bowed her head and quietly said yes. President Gong Ye Xiao then smiled with satisfaction and asked the young woman what he would get if he solved this problem. The young woman leaned on the table and sternly asked the president what exactly he wanted to receive in exchange for help. Then Gong Ye Xiao smiled contentedly. Some predatory lights lit up in his eyes, and he said that if Chen Li kissed him on the cheek, then he would help her solve this matter. Chen Li shouted that she would not do that and demanded that the president change the terms of their contract. But he just smiled and said that it looks like she doesn't have any more work now. The young woman realized all the horror of these words and could not even imagine that she would be left without her favorite business. So she approached Gong Ye Xiao and asked for his help. But Gong Ye Xiao was adamant. He himself pointed a finger at his shock and said that he does not like to repeat himself twice, and she heard the terms of the contract perfectly. Chen Li then closed her eyes and cursed that devilish man in her mind. She thought this was the last time he could take advantage of her, and she wouldn't let him manipulate her anymore. When Chen Li, with her eyes closed, decided to kiss his cheek and was already leaning in for a kiss, the president deliberately turned her head so that her lips met his. The young woman realized that she was kissing something not very similar to his cheek, so she opened her eyes and saw that they were kissing the president like an adult. Chen Li quickly pushed him away. The president was pleased, and a smile appeared on his face. At that moment, Chen Li shouted so loudly that he was a sneaky bastard that all the employees of the corporation heard it. Chen Li went back to the office after talking to the president and told Linda that Gong Ye Xiao asked to wait. But so much time has passed, and there is still no news from him. Linda tried to reassure the young woman and said that it had only been 2 hours since Chen Li returned, so there was no need to worry, and the president would take care of everything as promised. But an excited assistant ran into the room and said loudly that the designer was Yang Bingbing is already here, and besides, she came with several men in tow. This news completely knocked the ground out from under the feet of young women. They gathered together with their last strength to go through this grief together. And here's the designer. Linda couldn't contain her emotions any longer, so she threw the projects on the floor and cursed. She then said that the brat was already completely mocking them by stealing their designs. But before the young girls had time to discuss how to proceed, the door to the office suddenly opened and the designer Binbing entered, accompanied by several men. The men immediately started rummaging through things in the office. Chen Li yelled, "What were they doing here? And if they didn't stop this outrage, she would call the police." But Linda still advised Chen Li not to panic and not to take any rash actions until Gong Ye Xiao answered, especially since they still couldn't handle men on their own. Yang approached them. Bingbing said that Linda is too bold. If she continues to keep Chen Li at work, she risks going to prison. Chen Li Yue decided to stand up for her coworker and said that the designer did not speak so confidently because she would have to answer for her actions. Their tense conversation was interrupted by representatives of the police who quickly entered the office and loudly ordered everyone to stand aside so that she could do her job. Designer Yang Bingbing defiantly looked at Chen Li and haughtily said that she didn't have much time left to walk free because the police already had a warrant for her arrest. Li was speechless at that moment. Drops of sweat appeared on her forehead, and she already mentally imagined the pitfalls that await her after the arrest. She thought that Gong Ye Xiao was powerless to help. Yang is satisfied. Bingbing danced on the spot. She told the policeman that it was not easy to deal with this case, and now it was necessary to bring Chen Li to the police station as soon as possible. But the policeman turned to young Bingbing, showed her the arrest warrant. He said loudly that she was accused of commercial plagiarism and slander of someone else's copies. Yang Bingbing rehearsed that there had been a terrible mistake somewhere, and Chen Li should have been arrested, not her. But the police did not listen to him, but handcuffed him and led him to the exit. The men who came with the designer and rummaged through the things in the office were not left without attention. One of the policemen ordered to arrest them. A few minutes later, those men in handcuffs and accompanied by police representatives went to the exit. Of course, they tried to justify themselves, but the police said that they would deal with everything. In the meantime, rumors circulated around the office, such as who was behind Chen Li, that after 2 hours everything had changed completely, or whether it would be necessary to insult Chen Li next time. But Linda shouted loudly for the workers to stop gossiping and get to work faster. Meanwhile, the phone rang in Chen Li's pocket. The young woman looked at the screen. It was him. Gong Ye Xiao's voice was heard on the other end of the receiver. He asked with satisfaction if everything was settled with her question for now. Although in fact he already knew the answer to this question, the young woman said that everything was resolved for the best and thanked him for helping to sort everything out. Then Gong Ye Xiao told Chen Li that today his parents returned from abroad and they would also like to meet and see their grandson. The frightened Chen Li just moved away from the stress. She asked worriedly what they wanted. But the president reassured Chen Li that his parents don't want to take her son away. They just want to get to know him. So already at dinner, Chen Li put on a beautiful dress and dressed the little one. They arrived at the hotel, where a meeting with the parents of President Gong Ye Xiao was scheduled. Xiaoze held his mother's hand and obediently walked the whole way. But when he saw that the area was unfamiliar, he stopped and asked Chen Li where they had come from and what they were supposed to do here. The young woman decided to comfort her son, so she patted him on the head and said that they had come here to meet his grandparents. But when Chen Li approached the right room, she firmly decided for herself that Xiao He is her flesh and blood, so she will not divorce him under any circumstances, so that it does not happen. Chen Li knocked on the door, and when she heard a voice inviting her to come in, she opened the door and entered the room. But the president was already waiting for her, who introduced the relatives present. Gong Ye Xiao introduced his parents and younger sister. His sister immediately paid attention to the little boy, so that he became embarrassed and hid behind his mother's leg. But that didn't stop Sister Gong Ye Xiao. She quickly walked over to Xiao Shi, touched his cheeks. She cheerfully said that she was glad to finally meet her nephew. Little Aunt also liked it. It was as if visually he was even somewhat similar to her. That's why Xiaozhe smiled sweetly and said that he was also pleased to meet you. Then the sister took the baby in her arms and looked at Chen Li. She approached her and greeted her daughter-in-law. Chen Li was embarrassed and said that she was not a daughter-in-law, but just Xiao's mother, Zi. The president coughed and said that he should sit down to explain everything. That sister cheerfully asked him if there was such a woman with whom he also could not cope. Gong Ye Xiao tried to make excuses and said that he had no other choice because this woman was worried that someone might take her son away and treated him as an enemy. All eyes immediately turned to the bewildered Chen Li. She stood silently and did not know what to answer, so she decided to just say hello to those present and say that she was glad to meet you. The wise mother of the president decided to save the situation. She noticed how uncomfortable Chen Li was in this situation, so she invited her to sit at the table. When everyone sat down at the table, the president's mother said that Xiaozhe looks a lot like Gong Ye Xiao as a child and asked to hold the little boy in her arms. Of course, Chen Li agreed. The grandmother took her grandson in her arms, and immediately a smile graced her face. The grandfather also looked sweetly at his grandson and remembered his youth when they were babysitting his little son. Chen Li and the president were sitting next to each other. I watched Grandma and I play with Xiaozhe. It was obvious to the naked eye that they really liked the boy, so Chen Li took care of her little one. Then the president's mother turned to Chen Li and asked her if it was difficult to raise her son and raise him on his feet all these 4 years alone. The young woman was very worried that they might take her son abroad, but she answered the question that it was not difficult for her to raise her son alone, and she did it with pleasure. But the grandfather patted the little boy on the head and said that he and the younger sister of the president spend most of their time abroad, so they themselves will have to cope with the upbringing of the grandson. Hearing those words, Chen Li calmed down and thought that if the president's father said that, then maybe she shouldn't worry about them taking Xiao away from her. After that, there was a real family idol at the table. Grandfather, grandmother, and aunt were playing with little Xiaozhe, while Chen Li and Gong Ye Xiao sat opposite and couldn't help but be happy looking at them. Suddenly, Chen Li's phone rang. She knew that her close friends could not call her because they knew where she was, so the woman decided to see who was calling. When Chen Li looked at the phone screen, she saw Shen calling her Huan Yao. She understood that it was urgent and, apologizing, left the table to pick up the phone. On the other end of the phone, Chen Li's ex-husband's wife's voice began, saying in a superior tone that Chen Li should come immediately because there were some problems with the diamond ring. But Chen Li didn't want to leave the dinner with the president's parents, so she sternly replied that she didn't have time for the meeting now and told Shen Huan Yao postpone the meeting. But Shen Huan Yao insisted and shouted loudly into the receiver that if Chen Li did not come immediately, she would not pay for the work. Chen Li told the woman to name the place and time. And then Shen is satisfied. Huan Yao said that the woman should go to Bao Hotel Hui to the 10th floor, where she will be shown to her. And I thought to myself that today's event would not start without Chen Li. When the president met Chen Li in the corridor, he immediately noticed that the woman was extremely excited about something. Gong Ye Xiao immediately asked her if there was any problem. Then, Chen Li decided to tell that she had urgent business and asked the president to help her get to a certain place, because she no longer had time to call a taxi. Gong Ye Xiao asked when he needed to leave and said that he himself could drive the young woman to an urgent meeting, especially since his car was parked next to the hotel. But Chen Li categorically did not agree to his proposal and asked him to take her little son home after dinner and give her a driver so that they could get there faster. The president agreed and told Chen Li to wait downstairs, and he would send a driver to her now. Gong Ye Xiao decided that he would really have to take care of his son after dinner. When 10 minutes passed, the president went downstairs and decided to dial Chen Li's number. He was worried about her, so he decided to personally ask if the young woman had already reached the hotel and to ask what urgent matters had forced her to leave the dinner with her parents. But when the president dialed her number, he heard on the receiver that the number was not in service. Then Gong Yashao called again and again, but no one answered the president's phone call. Chen Li more than a joke. He looked at the phone and thought that there might be some trouble with Chen Li. Then the president dialed the driver's number and asked where Chen Li got out of the car. He replied that the young woman came out near the Bao Hotel Hui, asked what happened to the boss. The president immediately got behind the wheel and headed to the indicated address. He thought that the hotel was upscale, and that meant that Chen Li was definitely seeing someone there. These thoughts made the president uncomfortable, and he pressed the gas to full speed and drove in the direction of the hotel. He was not stopped even by the red light of the traffic lights on his way. When the driver drove the young woman to the specified place, she immediately went inside. Chen Li looked around, searching for Shen with her eyes Huan Yao, but she was nowhere to be found. Chen Li just thought about where she should look for Shen Huan Yao, how a woman appeared who introduced herself as Mr. Lu's assistant and said that she would take the woman upstairs. While Chen Li followed the assistant, she kept trying to find out exactly where they were going. But the assistant silently walked faster and faster. The young woman had already guessed that they were going to the ballroom, so she asked the assistant where they were going. She explained that Shen Huan Yao is waiting for her there. Meanwhile, the assistant gave a predatory smile and thought that this woman was Mr. Lu's ex-wife, and it should be a good show today. The hall door opened and she invited Chen Li to come inside. The young woman looked inside and saw that there were a lot of people in the hall. It was still very noisy there, and Chen Li began to think about what was happening there. Chen Li hesitated whether to go in there at all, because her inner sense told her that it was quite dangerous there. But the assistant did not give her time to think and pushed the young woman in the back. Chen Li didn't expect to be pushed, so she lost her footing and fell to her knees in the hotel ballroom. The door immediately slammed behind her. The young woman rose to her feet and tried to understand what was happening here. Shen Huanyao smiled in satisfaction and thought that Chen Li had finally arrived and would destroy her reputation. Everyone present immediately paid attention to the unexpected guest and began to whisper that today is the 4th anniversary of the wedding of Mrs. and Mr. Lu, and how this brat dared to come here. Shen Juanyao shouted that this woman was Lu's ex-wife Xuanya, but he broke up with her a long time ago. She then wondered why Chen Li had come to their party and committed such violence. Shen's speech Huan Yao started whispering that she was Mr. Lu's ex-wife and that Shen was good. Zhuang hired her as a designer to somehow support and help. The women immediately started whispering that she was caught in bed with another man, and that was why Mr. Lu broke up with her. And this brat had the audacity to rush into the Lu family's holiday. Everyone started poking fingers at poor Chen Li and yelling for her to get out of here, wishing her an early death and calling the prodigal woman last dirty words. Chen Li only now understood what Shen needed Huan Yao when she asked for an immediate meeting. She just wanted to frame Chen Li and specially set everything up. Lu Xuan asked his wife what was going on here and why Chen Li Wei had come to the ballroom during their wedding anniversary celebration. He was outraged by such a reason, but Shen Guanyao didn't like that he was taking care of Chen Li. Therefore, she pushed him in the chest and shouted loudly that she was his legal wife and this woman was nobody. Shen Guanyao got angry and walked quickly towards the frightened Chen Li. Her mood was just bad, and it did not bode well. So Mr. Lu began to shout for her not to do anything stupid. When Shen Huanyao came close to Chen Li, then she waved her hand at her and shouted that she had insulted her family, and for that, she would now beat her to death. But only Shen's hand, Huanyao, was flying towards Chen Li, about to slap her hard, when someone grabbed her in mid-flight and prevented her from hitting the young woman. Shen Juanyao looked at the one who grabbed her and saw President Gong Yexiao in front of her. He sternly told her that he had already warned her once not to touch Chen Li. Everyone present could barely contain their surprise, because the richest man in the world was standing before them and they could not believe it. Everyone asked one of them how he ended up here. At that moment, Juanyao thought that Chen Li had dragged him along with her. And her husband thought that Gong Yexiao had been doing business with the Lu family lately, and was anxious to keep things that way. Meanwhile, the president, ignoring the people present, approached Chen Li, hugged her, and asked if she was okay. She just blinked her eyes at the unexpected events and said yes. But then, Chen Li Yue, gathered all her will into a fist and thought that Shen Huanyao has already humiliated her several times in a row and cannot continue like this any longer. Chen Li gathered courage and decided to put an end to these gossips about her marriage once and for all. She said that everything was true and that she was Lu's wife, Jin Xuanya. But then Chen Li added that it was they who pumped her with drugs that day and put her in bed with a second husband, and then accused her of treason and wrote a divorce agreement. Li added that they threatened to post intimate photos on the internet and forced her to give up her father's stock in Lu's company. Shen Huan did not expect this and shouted that it was delusional. That young woman did not even think of going back on her words. She put her hand on her heart and said that she swore on her life that it was all true. And then Shen suggested Huan do the same. Shen Huanyao became nervous and beads of sweat appeared on her forehead. She said that she will not follow the instructions of some hoida and swear on her life. All the guests present began to whisper that they could not even think that Shen Huanyao is so mercantile, vile, treacherous, and that she has such a dark side that no one knew about. Shen Zhuan. At that moment, Yao was nervously trying to figure out what to do next. She could never have thought that such an influential man would stand up for Chen Li and protect her. Shen is then in mind Huan. The thought of Chen Li's illegitimate son flashed through Yao, and she decided to use this trump card. She approached the president and said that Li had a son by some savage. Shen Yuan. At that moment, Yao was so happy that she managed to throw dirt on Chen Li in front of such a respected gentleman. But Gong Yixiao asked if she was sure of what she said. And Shen Huanyao was satisfied and said that it was the truth. Then the president loudly said that this child belonged to him, and it was he who she now called a savage. Everyone present almost had their jaws dropped from such news. She couldn't say anything, only looking at the corporation president Gong and Shen in silence. Huanyao. Shen Guanyao's eyes widened when she heard that Chen Li's father was the richest man in the world, and her husband quickly ordered his wife to apologize to Gong Yixiao for her words. To do Shen Huan, Yao had no choice but to bow down to President Gong and apologize to him, explaining that her words had slipped off her tongue. Huan Yao already regretted that she had decided to publicly humiliate Li, and Gong Yixiao sternly said, "The next time she dares to insult Li and his son, he is not responsible for the consequences." Chen Li was satisfied that today's meeting ended like that, and she and the president went to the exit. No one wanted to be in this snake pit. Shen Huanyao decided to take her anger out on her husband, so she ran up to him and screamed how Chen Li had a child with Gong Yixiao. But he did not know the answer to this question. When the Lu couple finally came to their home after such a scandal, Lu Jinxuan hit his wife so hard that she fell on the bed. He shouted angrily for her to look at what she had done today with her act. That wife tried to assure him that she had no idea that the child's father was Gong Yixiao. Then Lu Jinxuanya pondered and said in his voice, "Could it even happen that it was Gong Yixiao who ended up with Chen Li that night 4 years ago, because it was hard to believe?" Shen Chuanya recovered from the man's hard blow and said while sitting in bed that it looked like that was exactly what happened that fateful night, and Chen Li was beaten very badly. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, at Gong Yixiao's house, Chen Li was putting their son Xiao to bed. He could not sleep for a long time. He kept telling his mother about his impressions of meeting his grandfather and grandmother. After Xiaozi fell fast asleep, Chen Li decided to work a little more and took some documents and went to the living room. It was there that Gong Yixiao was, who asked if their son was sleeping. Chen Li replied that her son had finally fallen asleep, and then she added that she would like to draw some pictures and asked the president to lend her the living room for work. The president said that, of course, he did not mind that the young woman worked here and promised to keep quiet while she was busy with business. That young woman decided to explain as correctly as possible that she was used to working alone, so she wanted him to leave the living room while she was painting. Then the president stood up and walked over to Chen Li. He offered her to paint his portrait, and if she could handle this order, he was ready to pay $100,000. Hearing the amount, Chen Li's eyes doubled in size, and she decided that the man was playing some games with her again, because such an amount was her salary for several months. Gong Yixiao could see that the young woman was hesitating and decided to take her on a weak note. He asked what was wrong with his proposal, and if she is a designer, then sketching should be easy for her. The challenge was accepted, and Chen Li decided to prove her professionalism to the president. Therefore, she agreed, but reminded him not to forget about the promised amount for the work. Gong Yexiu sat down on the couch and said that he would give her the money as soon as she finished the portrait, so she could start her work right now. Chen Li took the easel and sat opposite the president. Of course, she knew how to draw portraits quite well, and even if you are ready to pay decently for it, you can try. Gong Yexiu thought that he finally had an opportunity to make the young woman look at him seriously, and hoped that she would be impressed by his perfect face. When the young woman started work, she immediately paid attention to the ideal features of the man's face and concluded why it is not surprising that so many women lose their heads because of him. Gong Yexiu emerged on a piece of paper. The young woman was focused on her work and tried to cope well with the task. But during work, the strap of her dress fell and her shoulder was exposed. She immediately adjusted her dress and decided that they both needed to rest, which was what Gong Yexiu suggested. Chen Li suggested that she drink a little and rest, and then continue her work. But Gong Yexiu got up from the sofa and said that he didn't want to drink at all at the moment. And then, the young man came close to Chen Li and looked into her eyes. He said he was very hungry. These words sent shivers down Chen Li's spine. The young woman immediately decided to change the subject of the conversation and said that she would now go to the kitchen and get them both something to eat. But the president's hands reached for Chen Li's waist. He hugged her tightly and pulled her to him. His lips came close to hers, and he whispered for her not to go anywhere and kissed her passionately. That young woman was not going to tolerate such liberties from the president, so she quickly pushed him away and asked him not to use her in his interests. But Gong Yexiu looked at the young woman with surprise and replied that this was not the case in their relationship, and he had no intention of using her. That young woman screamed for him to get down on the ground and not think that the world has come together on him, because he will definitely not win her over with such cheap seductions. Then the young woman quickly removed the finished portrait of the president from the easel and said that she had already done the job, so now it was his promise. Gong Yexiu then said that he could see that the young woman needed money, so he had a good idea how she could earn it. And it will be a better way than drawing some sketches. Chen Li was putting away her painting supplies and said that she would listen to his proposal, and if it was interesting enough, she would be happy to take it into consideration. Then Gong Yexiu said that he had a business proposition. She would be his wife, and he would give her $100 million in return. But Chen Li listened to this proposal and replied that she was not interested in it. With such a deal, let him keep all his money. The indignant president stayed in the living room and watched as a satisfied Chen Li climbed up to the second floor, swinging her hips seductively. He shouted that this was a serious deal. The young woman calmly replied that he transferred the money for his portrait to her account and wished him a good night and sweet dreams. She was also in a hurry to rest. At that moment, the president thought that he would wait for the time when Chen Li Wei would willingly marry him. And he knew how to wait well and for a long time. The next morning in his office, thoughts about Gong Yexiu did not leave Chen Li's head. She wanted to keep her distance from him, but she understood that every day they were getting closer. Suddenly, the door to her office opened, and it made the young woman come back to reality. Her assistant said that someone was looking for Chen Li all over the office. When she asked who it could be, Yexiu appeared at the door of the office with a huge bouquet of roses. He said that these were the first roses delivered from Bulgaria and asked if they liked them. To say that Chen Li was shocked at that moment would be an understatement. She shouted indignantly, who allowed him to come to her office without permission? But the president smiled sincerely and said that he came for her. The young woman slammed the door in Gong Yexiu's face and shouted that she was allergic to flower pollen. While Gong Yexiu was recovering from such a reception, Chen Li added that he should ask when he can come to her next time and not allow himself such visits. An angry Gong Yexiu stood in front of the closed door of Chen Li's office and said that no woman would allow herself to treat Gong Yexiu this way, let alone accept flowers. The enraged president threw the flowers against the wall and quickly made his way to the exit. The women from the office just drooled when they saw such a handsome man with a gorgeous bouquet. Chen Li opened the door, and when she was sure that Gong Yexiu had left, she quietly left the study and headed for the exit. She decided that it was impossible to stay here after his arrival. Gong Yexiu's arrival at the office and describing to each other in color all the details of his visit. The girls envied Chen Li and wanted to be in her place. Chen Li decided that she should take a vacation and go with her son to her home to rest from everything. But when she went outside, an expensive car stopped next to her. A well-dressed man got out of the car and headed towards Chen Li. It was like what he wanted to see today. Lu Jinxuan suggested that she speak calmly, but the mood of the young woman was so to hell, so is he with his conversations. So Chen Li couldn't hold back and shouted for him to get the hell out of her sight. And Lu Jinxuan had no intention of leaving her alone. He came up, took her by the hands, and began to say that he needed to tell her something extremely important and to discuss many issues. The young woman started screaming for him to let go of her hands and leave her alone. And then someone grabbed her arm and quickly pulled her out of Lu's hands. Jin Xuanya Chen Li turned her head to see who it was. Gong Ye Xiao was somewhere near her, and from the expression on his face it became clear that he did not like what he saw. At that moment, she thought that he had not gone home. The president said in a stern voice that he had already warned Lu last time Jinxuan and his wife to leave Chen Li alone. But it was obvious that they did not heed the warning. But cunning Lu Jinxuan began to slowly move away from the angry president and said that if he was not mistaken, Chen Li was still unmarried, so she could choose who to talk to. But Gong Ye Xiao had already lost his patience to listen to stupid talk, and he knew very well that this fool would hardly have enough warnings, so he knocked him out with a strong blow. Lu Jinxuan could barely stay on his feet after such an unexpected blow. He began to rub his cheek, which hurt unbearably, and told President Gosen not to bend the stick. But the president wasn't into jokes, so he said that there was an even stronger blow and asked him if he wanted to try again. Gong Ye Xiao's mood was warlike. Chen Li decided to intervene in the showdown. She walked over to Lu Jinxuan and shouted loudly for him to just get away and never come across her path again. Gong Ye Xiao also asked Chen Li's ex-husband if he heard those golden words well, and expressed hope that he will remember today's lesson for a long time and will not have to repeat it. That young woman was already quite enraged by the courtship of both men, so she turned to the president and shouted loudly that he should stay away from her next time. Shocked, Gong Ye Xiao didn't even realize at first that these words were referring to him. After all, after what he did for her, he did not expect to receive such thanks. That young woman did not think to explain herself to anyone. She quickly turned and walked away from the surprised men. All she wanted at that moment was peace. But the president did not think to tolerate such an attitude towards himself. He ran after the young woman, though as soon as he moved away from the shock. On the way, he shouted for Chen Li to stop and listen to him. Lu decided to intervene in these clashes Jinxuan, the more he saw that President Chen Li was not very kind. Therefore, he shouted to her, does she remember how she was in love with him? When the young woman heard Lu's words, Jin Xuanya, she stopped. Chen Li decided to put an end to this relationship once and for all, so that there would be no further misunderstandings about her feelings. Chen Li Yue clenched her fists tightly and gathered her spirits. As soon as she dared, she immediately shouted loudly that it was before, and now the only feeling she has for him is hatred. Meanwhile, the president ran up to the young woman. He took her hands in his and looked into her eyes. He then asked Chen Li if she was in love with Lu Jinxuanya, because it worried him a lot. The president saw the answer in her eyes and did not need her words. So he began to come closer to her, and she only quietly asked what he was doing now. But Gong Ye Xiao was no longer listening to her questions and did not need her answers. He reached for Chen Li, but she was no longer resisting. Therefore, his hot lips were already next to hers. After a passionate kiss, President Gong Ye Xiao turned back to Lu Jinxuan and said loudly that Chen Li was now his wife and forbade him to approach her in the future. Lu Jinxuan fell to his knees and trembled with anger. He was angry that such a strong opponent as the president of the Gong Corporation began courting Chen Li. But at that moment, Lu Jinxuanya decided that no matter what happened in life, he would not give up his rights to Chen Li Yue and was not going to give her to anyone, not even the richest man in the world. Meanwhile, the president's car was gaining maximum speed. Chen Li looked out the window with fear and asked where she was flying like that. At that moment, she was seriously scared. Gong Ye Xiao replied that they were going home and their son was already waiting for them there. Chen Li exhaled and calmed down a little because she had already thought of something. But while they were alone, the young woman decided to find out about the relationship and asked Gong Ye Xiao not to come to her office when she was working there because she didn't like that at all. Gong Yixiao also decided to fully understand why the young woman did not like his visits. So he turned away from the road and asked Chen Li if she was ashamed of him sometimes. He joked and thought she would start to deny it, but Chen Li agreed with his guess and said that she was. He was simply indignant at how the richest man could be ashamed. At home, they did not talk to each other from the car itself. Gong Yixiao thought that Chen Li actually hated him, and the young woman got bored of him already in a whole day, so that she did not want to talk. Their son entered the room. He looked closely at his parents and noticed that they were sitting at opposite ends of the sofa and were not talking to each other. That's why the little one asked what happened. Chen Li and Gong Yixiao replied angrily in unison that nothing had happened. It was at that moment that they did not feel like politeness, and no one wanted to explain anything to the little one. Wu Xiao tears began to well up in his eyes. He didn't even expect such a rude answer, so he was very offended and was going to burst into tears right there. Chen Li and Gong Yixiao looked at their son. They were also shocked that the little one would react this way to them arguing. Therefore, they immediately decided to correct the situation. Parents ran up to their little one and began stroking his head. Gong Yixiao said that they didn't fight at all, and Chen Li added that Xiao could not be like that, it just seemed. The president then hugged Chen Li. She jumped up in surprise and was about to slap him, but Gong Yixiao told her son to see for himself that they did not quarrel. Chen Li smiled and decided that this time she would endure it for the sake of her son. The president also smiled and thought that he would not argue with Chen Li this time. The son took mom and dad by the hands and cheerfully said that they should never quarrel. And he mentally noted that pretending to be upset worked well this time so that the parents reconciled. The president took his son in his arms and said that it was already time for the obedient boys to sleep. Chen Li wished her son sweet dreams and ignored Gong Yixiao with the same wish. Late at night, Chen Li decided that she should take a shower and go to bed, because today's events will be enough from her. But just as she opened the door from the room, Gong Yixiao grabbed her and put her on the bed. She angrily asked what he was doing, and the man explained that now he will punish her for today's behavior. Before she had time to answer him, the man began to kiss her passionately. He also held her hand so that she could not resist, so for several minutes no one prevented him from kissing the beauty. But it did not last long. The young woman still managed to break free and push the president away from her. Chen Li shouted loudly so that he would not cross the line in their relationship. The president looked lustfully into her eyes and asked if she was not aroused by such a kiss, which pushed him away from her so quickly. Chen Li blushed to the tips of her ears and shouted for him to watch his tongue the next time he spoke such obscenities, and she was not interested in him as a man. Then, enraged, Chen Li threw the president out the door and slammed it loudly. The young woman quickly locked the door with the key and only then exhaled calmly. Behind the closed door, Gong Yixiao just cursed that he couldn't get Chen Li to bed. But then he promised himself that she would propose to him very soon. The next day, an expensive car stopped near the office where Chen Li worked. As soon as the door opened, two well-dressed young women came out. One of them with red hair looked around the building and asked if this is the place where Chen Li Wei currently works. And then, she added that it was simply ugly in appearance. Another of them said that while she was abroad, this Chen Li managed to spoil the relationship between her brother and sister-in-law, so they should teach this Chen Li a lesson today. Meanwhile, Li was quietly working in her office. Although it was difficult for her, she adjusted to work and worked on the project. The office door opened and an assistant appeared on the threshold. The assistant held a bouquet in her hands. She said that today the young man left a gift for Chen Li and gave the woman a bouquet. Chen Li took that bouquet and began to examine it. When the young woman looked at the contents of the bouquet, she saw that it consisted of chocolates and was beautifully decorated. Chen Li immediately thought that it was from Gong Yixiao. The assistant saw that Chen Li was pleased with the gift. She said that her lover was so romantic and said that she would go and do business, because there was already a lot of work. But Chen Li was not the assistant. She carried the bouquet and thought about how to put it nicely in her office. The woman had no idea that Gong Yixiao would not forget to send flowers when he was angry. The young woman couldn't be happier with how attentive the president was. He didn't even forget that she was allergic to pollen and replaced the flowers with chocolates. Before Chen Li had time to enjoy the gift, the door to the room suddenly opened and two young women appeared on the threshold. One of them said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Of course, Chen Li recognized that young woman. It was her ex-husband's sister, Lu Yakin. And it was she who took photos of Chen Li that night and then blackmailed him with those photos. Chen Li was not going to silently watch her being humiliated now. Therefore, she was the first to meet the women and ask them why they had come here. Lu Yakin immediately shouted that Chen Li was an unscrupulous scumbag who had been kicked out of her family several years ago, and she had the audacity to molest her brother again. But Chen Li shouted that it was her brother who molested her himself, and she didn't need anything from him. Then girlfriend Lu Yakin asked her why she was talking so much, because she wanted to teach Chen Li. Lu Yakin slyly looked at the table where there was a bouquet of flowers, and said that this is exactly what she was going to do now, so that this larva would not poke its nose into their family and know its place. Chen Li caught her predatory gaze, so she immediately took the bouquet from the table and asked what exactly they were going to do. The young woman felt that this conversation would definitely not end well. Lu's girlfriend Yakin immediately snatched the bouquet from Chen Li's hands and laughed wildly. She asked if someone else could give flowers to such a girl and started sniffing him. That woman immediately realized that this bouquet was not indifferent to Chen Li, so she took advantage of it. Chen Li shouted for the bouquet to be returned to her immediately and ran after the woman. The girlfriend threw that bouquet to Lu Yatsen laughed out loud. They both enjoyed mocking and humiliating Chen Li, and she helplessly tried to pick up that bouquet. Lu Yakin shouted that if this bouquet was so dear to Chen Li, then he would only have one end. She threw the bouquet on the floor and demonstratively began to stomp on it. After there was no trace left of the bouquet, and all the candies were crushed by the women's sharp heels, Chen Li glared at her guests. Chen Li sternly shouted that they were just mocking her, and they just laughed in response. This is exactly what they have been doing since they entered Chen Li's office. Lu Yakin replied that they would mock her as much as they wanted for insulting the Lu family. And if she continues to stick her nose in, it will bankrupt her company. Lu's girlfriend Yakin kept adding fuel to the fire and said that Chen Li's gut was too thin to resist them. But Chen Li got impatient and slapped Lu deliciously. Yatsin. Lu Yakin immediately grabbed her cheek and screamed how dare this bitch raise a hand to her. She mentally noted that Chen Li was not as much of a coward as she had been before. But Chen Li was not going to stop. She pounced on the victim with her fists and shouted that not only did she dare to slap her, but she was going to beat her until she got out of here. Lu Yakin shouted, for Xiaoyai immediately came to her aid, and her friend also jumped into the fight. They beat each other with such brutality that hair flew in different directions. Maybe they were killing each other, but suddenly the door to the room opened and Assistant Chen Li and her son appeared on the threshold. The assistant began to tell that she had brought her son and then stopped. The assistant examined the three women who were sitting on the floor and were bruised and immediately thought what had happened here during the time she was absent. Chen Li also lowered her head in shame. Chen Li immediately started to get up from the floor. She did not want her son to find out what happened here. Therefore, the young woman explained that the floor was very slippery, which is why everyone fell at the same time. Xiaozi approached his mother and looked at her. He immediately noticed that the mother had a bruise on her forehead, so he asked if she was in pain and if she needed medical help. Those two women also stood up, because it was quite risky to fight in front of witnesses. They put themselves in good order and headed for the exit, threatening to see Chen Li soon. Chen Li's office. She looked at their backs and thought that these troubles were the only ones she didn't have enough of, in addition to all her troubles. Clever Xiaozi immediately thought that the mother was injured not because of a fall on the slippery floor, but rather because of those two evil aunts. The assistant approached Chen Li as soon as those women left their room and asked if she was okay. Chen Li replied that it was just a small scratch and nothing more. Ta Xiaozi decided to immediately call his father and inform him that someone was allowing his mother to be bullied. The boy quickly took out his phone and dialed the number he needed. The assistant insisted that Chen Li be examined at the hospital, and Chen Li decided not to argue. In the hospital, the son constantly asked his mother whether those two evil aunts had done this to her or not. The young woman saw how her son was worried that someone was allowing his mother to be bullied, so she decided to assure him that she had injured herself. Ta Xiaozi looked at his mother and said that she was not telling him the truth, and he himself saw her scratches with his own eyes, and as soon as Dad came to them, he would ask to beat them. The young woman did not want to involve Gong Yexiao in her feud with the Lu family, so she tried to persuade Xiaosi did not tell Dad about it and said that Dad should not be disturbed. But the door to the ward suddenly opened, and Gong Yexiao appeared on the threshold. He smiled and asked what they were agreeing to not bother him about. Chen Li, who did not expect to see him here, called out his name. And the son was so happy that the father did not leave them in trouble that he ran to him quickly and hugged his beloved father. Gong Yexiao immediately approached the young woman and asked her what had happened. Although it was clear to the naked eye that his wife had recently been beaten, Chen Li smiled and tried to speak calmly, giving the impression that she was telling the truth. Chen Li said that she just accidentally tripped and fell. Ta Xiaozhe was not going to stand by when his mother was being insulted. He told his dad that it wasn't true and that his mom was beaten by 2 evil aunts. Chen Li asked the little one not to talk nonsense. The president realized that he would not learn anything from Chen Li, so he decided to talk to his son. Gong Yexiao knelt down and asked the little one if he knew those aunts. Here, Chen Li calmed down. After all, Xiaozhe had never met those women before, so he couldn't say who she was. Therefore, the young woman calmed down a little. But the boy turned out to be smart beyond his years. Koi took the phone out of my pocket and handed it to my father. The boy said that he managed to take a photo of those ants on his phone camera. The young woman clearly did not take this into account and did not even expect it from a 4-year-old child. The only thing she thought about at that moment was when he managed to do it. The little boy looked into his father's eyes and asked if he knew these aunts. The president carefully looked at the photos, but the women were not familiar to him. But Gong Yexiao said that he could find out. The young woman decided to intervene because she could see that Gong Yexiao had already started, and it would be very difficult to stop him. Therefore, she said that it is not necessary to inflate such a problem because of a scratch. But the president came close to Chen Li. He took her chin in his hands and looked into her eyes. Then he said in all seriousness that whoever hit his wife would pay for it very quickly. Gong Yexiao took out his phone and showed the photos his son had taken to his assistant. He also said that within a minute, he needed all the information about these women. Not even a minute passed when his phone rang, and his assistant on the other end of the receiver said that all the detailed information had already been sent to his email. The president opened the email address and read that the first woman was Lu Yaqin, 20 years old, is the daughter of the Lu family, and the second is Xiao Yai, 20 years old, daughter of a rich businessman. Chen Li saw how carefully the president was studying the information he received on the phone, so she approached him and asked what he had decided to do. She actually cared about him. But Gong Yexiao smiled and told her not to worry about anything and leave all these problems to him. He will deal with it very quickly, and she should gather her strength. The president said goodbye to his son and Chen Li and quickly left the chamber. The door slammed loudly. The young woman looked at him and wondered what he was going to do. As soon as the president got to his office, the first thing he did was call Lu Yatsen and invited him to come to his office tomorrow to discuss some urgent matters.